Welcome to the Green Lab Futures Talking Social Innovation podcast with your host, me, Scott Douglas. We'll be bringing you the conversations that we are having with industry, education and the community to help us develop and shape our views and understanding on the future roles of social innovation. We hope you enjoy. Welcome to our one-on-one chat with Dr. Merryn Paynter. How are you this morning, Merryn?
Good, thank you, Scott. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks very much for joining this chat. So we're looking at having a bit more of a deep dive around some of the work that you've been doing, or a lot of the work that you've been doing over the last 6 years in your PhD, and some of the other work that you've been doing as well within the community. So let's jump in. Firstly, PhD, 6 years, a big journey.
Huge, real roller coaster. And PhDs are psychological beasts as much as they are just hard work. So every step of the way is a struggle, and you work hard towards it, but the end results and the rewards at the end are just, I think the personal rewards are significant. So I'm glad. I'm glad I've got it.
Excellent. And the topic that you were working on was around the storytelling component from major corporates. Is that right?
So I looked at the organisational storytelling and storytelling strategies used by major corporations to manage impressions. So I delved into looking into the explicit and implicit storytelling that companies tell about corporate social responsibility, looking at the whole of organisational storytelling, but also the visual and language storytelling that is used. So, and some of the implied storytelling I looked at, for example, was the difference between storytelling about corporate social responsibility in annual reports compared to separate sustainability reports. I looked at things like the organisational strategy statements and how they aligned to the claims that they were making about corporate social responsibility and the integration of corporate social responsibility into the organisation. So to achieve that, I studied annual reports and CSR reports published by BHP, Westpac and Westfield over a 25-year period, and from 1992 to 2017. So so that was the whole thing.
Wow, and that is a very big undertaking to be able to kind of look at both the figures and the story that's being put out there, to look at that comparison. And
even comparing the text-based storytelling from the visual storytelling. So things like, within an annual report, they might use photos of female employees, but when you actually read the numbers of employees within the organisation, you might find that there's only 1% who were female employees, and yet the picture representation of employees throughout the reports predominantly show women.
Wow.
That's mostly apparent in reports dating through the 1990s up to the mid-2000s. But there's an example of how you've got, you can draw a lot from those, making those sorts of comparisons.
Like, that's obviously a clear, not a cover-up, but a way of expressing gender equity that potentially isn't there, but is there, isn't it? But the story that they're trying to tell.
Very much so. And I mean, we're seeing it now. Woolworths, for example, I believe have been signatories for the reconciliation action, and they've had a reconciliation action plan in place for the best part of a decade. But recently, one of their subsidiary companies, Dan Murphy's, has been found to be selling alcohol to Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory and taking advantage of issues with surrounding alcoholism in that part of Australia.
All right. And so that's like, I get the message that a number of these kind of larger organisations, it needs to join up when you're an ASX listed company, because that's what people are investing into. But I imagine for the smaller companies as well, it's a really good process for them to understand early.
Look, storytelling is an external and an internal process. So we talk about storytelling as sometimes in the context of marketing and public relations, but storytelling is also an internal thing. So it's also a strategic tool for analysing how the messages in the organisation all fit together. So internally, the storytelling as an analytical tool can help to analyse whether the strategic statements match up with what's in the governance statements. It's analysing whether all the parts fit together and how they fit together, and whether those project a story, much like a jigsaw puzzle piece. You know, jigsaw puzzle with all the pieces. When you put all those pieces together, what does it say? And
that's a really good analogy. I like that.
Yeah.
And sorry, I just wanted to touch on that point that you mentioned there. So that can also depict the culture that some may see or think exists within an organisation versus what actually exists.
Hugely. Organisational culture is a huge part of storytelling, and the cultural impact on the myths that develop within an organisation about what that organisation actually is. Well, we often hear about, you know, the tone of an organisation is set at the top, and it certainly is. But some organisational cultures are so strong and so embedded within certain ideologies. You know, they're so focused on certain ideologies that to transition them to a more sustainable space or a greater focus on renewable energy, all that sort of thing, it's a significant change.
Absolutely, and it becomes more of a top-down approach where the top has to be fully on board with this change in order for them to even want to consider empowering the people.
Most importantly, if they don't get that story right, it's all well and good to produce media releases, company reports, social media reports that say that they are doing one thing. But if in essence the organisational culture isn't built around that, what you're going to find is you will attract a lot of stakeholder scepticism, and you may struggle to attract investors. You may struggle in a lot of ways, but you also might find when you do try to initiate a new strategy, it might not be sustainable until you get all of your ducks in a row.
Right, and I really love that point that you mentioned about the raising capital and potentially seeking external funding, because if the story that you're telling internally doesn't match the story that is being projected externally, then people will hesitate until the two connect or the two become parallel.
Fortunately, people are suspicious, and I mean, we only need to look at examples of philanthropic organisations where there's been a misappropriation of funds. We only need to look at companies who have been involved, you know, have reported about substantial corporate social responsibility policies and initiatives, who have then gone on to engage in less appropriate behaviours.
Yeah.
So, and what has happened as a result of that is people are wary.
And that becomes challenging if you're publicly announcing a listing, absolutely. Yeah. And so if we kind of move the direction of what we're talking about to the actual corporate social responsibility of big companies, what were your findings? If you're happy to share them, just briefly.
I'm happy to share. Well, I found BHP, for example, they don't shy away from the fact that they are a mining and minerals handling company. because that's what they do. They don't shy away from the fact that what they do does have a significant environmental impact. But their corporate social responsibility message focuses on best practices. So they proclaim that they have the best practices for managing their environmental impact. They have the best governance practices for managing the social impact of their operations, particularly in developing countries. So though all those factors are in place, so that was their story. So their story was all about best practices. Westpac, their whole corporate social responsibility storytelling was about, particularly in the 2000s, I'm sure older people would remember the advertising campaign showing oil-drenched penguins being rescued, and the equator principles, the fact that they'd actually become signatories to which prohibited them from signing up any new loan deals with carbon-intensive industries, that sort of thing. And so their whole marketing message for particularly the later part of the 2000s was all around us being, or them being the best. And Westfield took an entirely different approach, and they're very much, up until 2015, they simply did the bare minimum. They did what they needed to do, and they did little to publicise what they were doing. In fact, compared to the other two companies, they only produced a separate sustainability report from 2017 onwards. So when you look at each of those things, they're three very different approaches. But then when you delve into their storytelling, what the stories are that they are actually telling about corporate social responsibility and the integration of corporate social responsibility into the organisation, each tells very different stories. I guess the really interesting thing that, and I love telling this one, Westpac, for all of their fanfare, I found their reports to be perhaps a little bit more misleading at times. So there was a lot of grey area between reporting about how the sale, by them providing financial lending products to the community, they were reporting about how they were providing a social benefit. And this was a frequent theme in a lot of their reports. And well, as the Haynes Royal Commission into the banking industry found, a lot of the Australian banks were in fact making financial products available to the community, but sometimes to people who were very particularly vulnerable and didn't understand what they were signing up for. So you question the social benefit there.
Yeah, far out. And that's so fascinating, because it's interesting as well with what you mentioned about BHP having that really clear message around best practice and kind of the BHP way versus everyone else's.
Yes. And
without mentioning, of course, who everyone else is.
And of course, BHP, I mean, you know, they had the Sumarko tailings dam collapse in 2015, but it was owned by a third party, but it was a joint venture owned between themselves and another company. In the last 10 to 15 years, there's been at least 2 or 3 allegations about corrupt behaviour. So, yeah.
And when we talk about where to from here with this storytelling narrative, we're experiencing, so in Gippsland, there's a shift away from coal-fired power stations. There's a move to renewable energy. We see a strong need for that story to be transparent to the community, not just a story that can be told by a bureaucrat or a politician, but something that can actually connect with the people in the community. Is that
what I see? There's been some material that has been written about new organisations being able to more successfully integrate sustainable practices in the organisation from the get-go. If you can do it from the get-go and make it a profitable enterprise, then there is a sense of excitement. People want this. Aside from what I've said previously about stakeholder scepticism, there is a real demand in the community for reducing carbon emissions. There is a real demand in the community for improved recycling and reusing of materials. People don't want to dig a big hole and bury their waste anymore. Life has got to move on. It's the 21st century. We're beyond that.
We've evolved a little bit away from those wooden bats that we used to walk around with.
That's right.
And it's almost like this evolution in the way that we look at energy is happening. It's happening slowly, but like that story. I think the value around how we build that narrative is what will construct the next 20 to 30 years in that space.
And I think the key is transparency. So make sure the story is transparent. So, you know, for example, with it's great that so many houses around my area have solar panels and solar batteries, you know, and it's something that I'm looking into myself. But the sort of information that I'm looking at before I actually make that leap is things like the product life cycle, the recyclability of those panels in 20 years when they've reached the end of their lives, but also the materials that have been used to make them. So the lithium, for example, I don't want to be putting in lithium batteries if I find out that the supply chain, upstream in the supply chain, you've got kids mining them in the Congo or somewhere like that. Do you know? And that's what you need to make sure. You need to make sure your story is absolutely transparent.
Yeah, right. And that social risk becomes even more apparent for new ventures that are building. So I've seen an example in Gippsland where there's a couple of wind farms coming up, and the social risk has been overlooked in one community, and it hasn't been totally rejected, but it's pretty categorical that it has been rejected by the community because they're not happy with the components of not just the supply chain that you mentioned there, but that the story outbound that they're projecting.
Yeah, but on the other hand, people want to go this way. So, you know, it's there. The demand is there, but you've just got to make sure that the story is transparent and clear, that it all fits together. It's logical in the way it fits together. There aren't any holes in the stories, but people are ultimately suckers for good news stories too. You know, we need a lot of those.
Yeah, we do. We need the good news stories, and then I suppose, occasionally need those reality checks that are not just best practice, but evidence-based and support decisions instead of decisions being made without evidence, which we see happen a little bit in today's modern corporate environment. Just the one last point, Merryn, with regards to the large corporates with how they tell their stories. Are we seeing a shift and a change kind of moving beyond now, or the stories that you've analysed versus what you're now seeing out there?
There certainly has been a shift in the banking storytelling. So the story, like even you'll see in the marketing, that sort of thing that produced by the Big Four, there is the step away from the message of hard sell. There is sort of more of a message out there about, you know, socially responsible lending practices, that sort of thing. But COVID certainly had a significant impact on the way companies tell stories, because it's been such a disruptive event globally that companies are saying a lot of their marketing is stepping away from being only there for shareholder interests, which at the moment they can't afford to be, especially with falling profits and that sort of thing too. But I mean, as I said, with the Woolworths example previously, and also Telstra, they've been caught out doing similar things, engaging in similar practices in northwestern Australia, where they are providing expensive mobile phone plans to people, vulnerable people who don't understand what they're signing up for. Unfortunately, it's still happening. So you've still got these mixed messages that are out there. But on the other hand, you've got organisations that are doing wonderful things.
And it's almost like this this final thought that I've been considering recently is the kind of going back to the workplace culture and the story told with the remote workforce. We're seeing this really big shift away from people not being able to have the connective conversation that they might normally have at the corner of their desks, or the water cooler type conversations, because people aren't in that workplace. And I think I'm really interested to see where that story ends up in the next 12 months, because ultimately that's how people are going to be attracting talent to their workplaces based on.
And the other factor too, you've got new entrants into the workforce. You've got some of the old guard reaching the end of their working lives. So, for example, I'm thinking back to the Me Too, the issues surrounding Me Too and misogyny in the workplace. I worked for a bank myself. I worked in the early 2000s, and it was a very male-dominant corporate environment. In fact, I can think of a few places that are more male-dominant. It was, my example was team building activities involved going to King Street nightclubs and strip clubs and that sort of thing, where the women just weren't invited, that sort of thing. Now, a lot of those individuals are, they're in their late 50s, early 60s now. So you sort of hope that once they retire and you've got the new people coming into the workforce with new ideas and new social expectations, that you'll see that cultural shift happen within organisations. One can only hope.
Yeah, gosh, I really hope so. And I think I have seen a few of those workplaces that are shifting, because, gosh, that culture, if it's not inclusive of everyone, it's like it obviously pushes people away, and that creates resentment, and then people don't want to work in that organisation.
Or worse, people think that that's just how it is and they have no choice. There's also that too.
Absolutely.
And I saw some of the toxic selling behaviours that were identified in the Royal Commission too. That's all there, but end of their working lives, and they will move over, and with that will come the change. And I think a lot has happened to bring the changes in anyway in the last 10 to 15 years. But it's still going to require a cultural shift.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, we'll finish our conversation. So thank you very much for your time this morning, Merryn. I really appreciate you giving your insight, not just to your experience, but also the analysis and the depth of work that you went through with your PhD and having that completed. So thank you for sharing that with us, and then also congratulations for completing.
Yay! Thank you for the opportunity. It's a good thing for me to do. It helps to bring me back to the world of research that I have been involved in, and I've enjoyed being a part of the Green Lab talks. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Merryn. Cheers.
Thanks, Scott. Okay.